The encounter. The rain fell heavily, drenching the crowded alien marketplace. Strange creatures from across the galaxy bustled about, some shouting to sell their goods, others too busy haggling to notice the small figure slumped in the shadows. Lyra, an alien girl with glowing violet eyes and thin, frail limbs, sat hunched near a wall. Her stomach growled painfully, but she lacked the strength to move. Clutching her empty satchel, she watched the crowd with a mix of fear and desperation. She had been on the run for weeks. Every corner of this planet felt hostile, and the endless rain made everything worse. The sharp smell of alien spices and fried food from the stalls filled the air, taunting her. Her fingers itched to grab something, anything to eat, but she knew what would happen if she was caught. As she gathered her courage to stand, her legs gave out, and she fell face first into the mud. A few passers-by glanced her way but quickly turned their heads. Nobody wanted to get involved. Lyra's vision blurred, and just as darkness threatened to consume her, she heard footsteps approaching. A voice, deep and steady, broke through the noise. "Hey, you okay?" She blinked up and saw a tall figure crouching beside her. His face was human, with sharp features and a hint of stubble. He wore a dark, weathered jacket and had a backpack slung over one shoulder. His brown eyes were filled with concern, something Lyra hadn't seen in a long time. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook too much. "I'm fine," she mumbled, though her voice betrayed her weakness. "You don't look fine," the human said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver-wrapped bar. "Here, eat this." Lyra hesitated. She had learned to be wary of kindness. Kindness often came with a price. Her glowing eyes darted between the bar and the human's face. "Why are you helping me?" "Because you need it," he said simply, holding the bar closer. Her hunger won over her fear. She snatched the bar and tore it open, devouring it in seconds. The taste was plain, but it filled her empty stomach like a feast. She looked up at him, still unsure of his motives. "Thank you," she whispered. The human smiled faintly. "Don't mention it. What's your name?" She hesitated again before replying. "Lyra." "Well, Lyra, my name's Carter. What's a kid like you doing alone in a place like this?" Her expression hardened at the question. She didn't want to talk about her past. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm just trying to survive." Carter nodded as if he understood more than she had said. He stood and held out his hand. "Come on, you can't stay here. You'll freeze in this rain." Lyra stared at his hand, unsure if she could trust him. But the warmth in his voice felt genuine, and she had no other options. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm but not rough, and he pulled her to her feet. As they walked through the market, Carter asked, "Do you have anywhere to go?" She shook her head. "No, I've been hiding. Running." "Running from who?" he asked, his tone cautious. Lyra's eyes darted around nervously. "I don't know if I can tell you." "You don't have to," Carter said quickly, sensing her fear. "But if you're in trouble, it might help if I know who we're dealing with." Before she could answer, Carter's sharp gaze shifted behind them. Two large aliens with reptilian features were watching them from a distance. Their scales glistened in the rain, and their eyes locked onto Lyra like predators eyeing prey. "Stay close to me," Carter muttered, his voice calm but firm. Lyra glanced back and felt a chill run through her. "They're from the Syndicate," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're looking for me." Carter's jaw tightened. "Figures. Let's keep moving." He led her through the maze-like streets, keeping a steady but unhurried pace. The reptilian aliens followed, their footsteps echoing ominously behind. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't meant to drag this stranger into her mess, but now he was in danger because of her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Because I can." Before Lyra could respond, The sound of boots splashing in puddles grew louder. The syndicate goons were closing in. Carter stopped abruptly and turned to face them, pulling a small device from his belt. It extended into a sleek, metallic weapon that hummed softly. "Get behind me," he told Lyra. The two aliens stepped forward, their sharp teeth gleaming as they sneered. "Hand over the girl, human. She's not your problem." Carter's grip on his weapon tightened. "She is now." The tension was electric as the two sides stared each other down. The rain fell harder, but Carter stood firm, unshaken. Lyra watched him, her fear mingling with a spark of hope. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. And for the first time in years, Carter felt like he had a reason to fight. A dangerous proposition. Lyra sat in the dimly lit cabin of Carter's freighter. The hum of the engines a steady background noise. The ship was small and utilitarian, with metal walls and exposed wiring. But to her, it felt like a sanctuary after weeks of running. She clutched the thermal blanket Carter had handed her, her glowing violet eyes darting nervously around the room. Despite the warmth of the cabin, a chill clung to her, the weight of her pursuers pressing heavily on her mind. Carter leaned against the console, arms crossed, his sharp brown eyes studying her. He wasn't one to bring strangers aboard his ship, let alone get involved in someone else's fight. But there was something about Lyra, the haunted look in her eyes, the way she carried herself despite her clear exhaustion, that made him stay. "You going to tell me what's really going on?" Carter finally asked, breaking the silence. Lyra hesitated, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "You wouldn't believe me if I did." Carter snorted softly. "Try me. I've seen a lot out here, things that'd make most folks' heads spin." She glanced up at him, unsure if she could trust him. But the memory of him standing between her and the syndicate thugs flashed in her mind. He could have walked away, left her to her fate. But he hadn't. Maybe he deserved to know. "They're after me because I escaped," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My people, we were taken, enslaved by the syndicate." Carter's jaw tightened. He'd heard of the syndicate before, a sprawling criminal organization that thrived on exploitation and fear. "What kind of work?" he asked, though he already had a grim idea. "Labor," she said, her voice cracking. "They put us in mines, factories, anywhere they could profit. If we couldn't keep up, they'd—" She stopped, her hands trembling as she stared at the floor. Carter didn't press her. He'd seen enough suffering in the galaxy to fill a lifetime. But it didn't make hearing about it any easier. "How did you get out?" I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaky. "There was a riot at one of the camps. It was chaos. I just ran and kept running." Her word hung in the air for a moment before she continued, her voice lowering. "But it's not just that. There's something else, something I have." Carter raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Lyra looked away, guilt and fear etched across her face. "I didn't mean to take it," she said quickly. "It was an accident. But now, they want it back." Carter frowned. "What are you talking about?" Slowly, Lyra reached into the satchel at her side and pulled out a small metallic sphere. It pulsed faintly with an otherworldly glow, intricate patterns shifting across its surface like liquid light. Carter's eyes widened. "What is that?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I don't know," she admitted. "It was in the overseer's quarters. I grabbed it without thinking. But now—" She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "They'll do anything to get it back. I think it's important. Really important." Carter stared at the sphere, a knot forming in his stomach. He didn't know what it was, but he could tell it was nothing good. "You're telling me you've been running from the syndicate because of this thing?" Lyra nodded. "If they catch me, I won't survive." For a long moment, Carter said nothing. He wasn't a hero. He was just a guy trying to make it in a galaxy that didn't care about people like him. Getting involved in something this big was the last thing he wanted. But as he looked at Lyra, huddled in his blanket, he knew he couldn't walk away. "We need to get rid of it," he said finally. "Find someone who can handle this kind of heat." Lyara's eyes widened. "No, we can't. If it's as dangerous as I think it is, we can't let them have it." Carter ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Do you have any idea what you're asking? Going up against the Syndicate isn't like dealing with a couple of thugs. They've got resources, fleets, entire planets under their thumb." "I know," she said softly. "But if we don't stop them, who will?" Her words struck something deep within him. He hated it, but she was right. The Syndicate wouldn't stop with her. Whatever this thing was, it had the power to tip the balance in their favor. And the galaxy was already on a knife's edge. Before he could respond, a loud beeping filled the cabin. Carter turned to the console and saw the proximity sensors lighting up. His stomach dropped. "We've got company," he said grimly. Lyara's eyes filled with fear. "It's them, isn't it?" Carter nodded, his mind racing. "Probably." The freighter shuddered as the ship's comm crackled to life. A deep, menacing voice filled the cabin. "This is Captain Drawl of the Crimson Syndicate. Surrender the girl and the artifact, and we might let you live." Carter turned off the comm and grabbed the controls. "Hold on, kid. This is going to get rough." As the freighter surged forward, the chase began, and Carter realized he was in far deeper than he'd ever planned. But something about Lyara's determination gave him a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could outrun the Syndicate and stop whatever plan they had in motion. And maybe, for the first time in years, Carter wasn't just surviving. He was fighting for something. Secrets on the ship. The hum of the freighter's engines filled the cabin as Carter adjusted the controls, his face tense with concentration. The ship was in hyperspace now, but the tension in the air hadn't lifted. Lyara sat across from him in the co-pilot's seat, her violet eyes fixed on the swirling patterns outside the viewport. Her hands rested on the strange metallic sphere in her lap, its faint glow casting eerie shadows across the dimly lit cockpit. "Don't keep staring at it," Carter muttered, breaking the silence. "It'll only make you more nervous." Lyara looked up at him, startled. "I wasn't." She stopped, realizing he was right. She let out a shaky breath and placed the sphere on the console in front of her. "I can't help it. It feels alive." Carter gave the sphere a wary glance. "Yeah, well, let's hope it doesn't start talking." Despite the attempt at humor, his tone was serious. The artifact was unlike anything he'd ever seen, and that was saying something. He'd traveled to countless planets, worked with every kind of alien, and seen tech that defied explanation. But this was different. He stood and stretched, his boots echoing softly against the metal floor. "We've got a few hours before we drop out of hyperspace. You hungry?" Lyara shook her head. "No, I'm just tired." Carter studied her for a moment. Her shoulders were slumped, her frame too thin, and her eyes carried a weight far beyond her years. She reminded him of someone he'd lost a long time ago. He pushed the thought aside and grabbed a ration pack from the storage compartment, tossing it to her. "Eat anyway. You'll need your strength." She caught it clumsily and hesitated before opening it. The familiar, bland smell of nutrient paste filled the air. Lyara wrinkled her nose but took a bite, chewing slowly. Carter leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "So," he began, his voice casual but probing, "you said you didn't mean to take that thing. But now you're sure it's dangerous. Why?" Lyara swallowed and looked down at the sphere. "I overheard them talking," she admitted. "The overseer and his guards. They said it was ancient, older than their species, maybe older than any species." Carter raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold claim." "I know," Lyara said quickly, her voice rising. "But they were scared of it. I could see it in their faces. They didn't know how it worked, but they wanted to use it, turn it into a weapon or sell it to someone who could." Carter frowned. "And now they want it back." She nodded, her hands clenching into fists. They'll stop at nothing. They'll destroy anyone who gets in their way." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Carter paced the cabin, his boots thudding against the floor. He'd seen what desperation and greed could do, how entire planets could fall under the weight of ambition. And now, thanks to Lara, he was caught in the middle of it. "Why didn't you just leave it behind when you escaped?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Lara flinched, and he immediately regretted his words. "I don't know," she said softly. "Something told me to take it. Like it was meant for me." Carter stopped pacing and stared at her. "Meant for you," he echoed. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't explain it. But when I touched it, I felt something. A connection." Carter exhaled slowly, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "A connection? To what?" "I don't know," Lara said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But it felt alive and powerful, like it was calling out to me." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words sinking in. Carter didn't believe in fate or destiny, but he couldn't deny the strange pull this artifact seemed to have, not just on Lara, but on the entire situation. Before he could respond, the ship's warning alarm blared, cutting through the quiet. Carter snapped to attention, rushing back to the cockpit. He scanned the controls, his heart sinking as the display lit up with red indicators. "What's wrong?" Lara asked, her voice tight with fear. Carter's jaw tightened. "We've got a tail. They followed us into hyperspace." Lara's face paled. "How? I thought hyperspace was secure." "It is," Carter said grimly, pulling up the tactical display. "Unless they've got a tracker on us, or someone really good at predicting our route." The comm system crackled to life, and a familiar voice filled the cabin. "Carter. Lara. I know you can hear me." Lara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Carter's expression darkened as he recognized the voice. It was Captain Drall, the Syndicate's enforcer, the same one who had issued their ultimatum earlier. "You can run, but you can't hide," Drall continued, his tone smug. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you. Hand it over, and maybe we'll let you live." Carter leaned over the comm panel and hit the mute button. "Yeah, that's not happening." "What are we going to do?" Lara asked, her voice shaking. Carter's eyes flicked to the sphere, still glowing faintly on the console. "First, we make sure they don't get their hands on that thing. Second, we figure out how to get them off our backs." "And if we can't?" Lara asked, her voice barely audible. Carter glanced at her, his expression hard but not unkind. "Then we make sure they regret ever chasing us." With that, he adjusted the controls, preparing the ship for evasive maneuvers. Lara watched him, a flicker of hope breaking through her fear. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. And as Carter set the ship on a new course, he couldn't help but feel the same. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The chase. The freighter jolted violently as it dropped out of hyperspace into the vast, star-filled void. Alarms blared in the cockpit, red lights flashing across the controls. Carter gritted his teeth, gripping the control stick tightly as he scanned the readouts. A massive syndicate ship loomed behind them, its sleek black hull reflecting the distant starlight. "They're gaining on us," Lara shouted from the co-pilot's seat, her voice filled with panic. "I can see that," Carter snapped, trying to keep his focus. "Strap in. This isn't going to be a smooth ride." The syndicate ship fired its weapons, and streaks of bright plasma zipped past the freighter, narrowly missing its hull. Carter yanked the control stick hard to the left, sending the ship into a sharp dive. Lara grabbed the edges of her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. "How are they still tracking us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I thought we lost them in hyperspace." "They've got tech way more advanced than this bucket of bolts," Carter replied, glancing at the outdated navigation system. "But that doesn't mean they're smarter than me." He flipped a series of switches on the console, redirecting power to the engines. The freighter groaned in protest but surged forward, putting a small distance between them and their pursuers. Carter's fingers flew across the controls as he plotted a course toward a nearby asteroid field. An asteroid field? Liara asked, her eyes wide as she realized where they were headed. Are you crazy? Probably, Carter said with a smirk. But it's our best shot. Big ships like theirs can't maneuver as well in tight spaces. The freighter plunged into the dense field of floating rocks, the ship weaving through the debris with remarkable precision. Liara watched in awe as Carter piloted the freighter like it was an extension of himself, his sharp eyes scanning the field for every opening. Behind them, the Syndicate ship hesitated at the edge of the field before pursuing. It fired again, this time hitting an asteroid that exploded into smaller fragments, pelting the freighter. We can't take much more of this, Liara yelled, clutching the sphere that pulsed faintly in her hands. Then let's make it interesting, Carter said, a spark of determination in his voice. He pushed the throttle to its limit and flipped a switch to release the freighter's cargo hold. Containers filled with scrap metal and debris spilled out, creating an impromptu minefield behind them. The Syndicate ship collided with the debris, its shields absorbing the impact but slowing its advance. Carter took the opportunity to dive deeper into the field, using the cover of larger asteroids to hide their position. We lost them for now, he said, exhaling heavily. But it won't be long before they catch up again. Liara stared at him, her fear slowly giving way to curiosity. How do you do that? She asked. Do what? Stay so calm under pressure. It's like you're not even afraid. Carter chuckled dryly, leaning back in his seat. Oh, I'm afraid. I just don't let it show. Fear's only useful if you can control it. Liara nodded, absorbing his words. She glanced at the sphere in her hands, its glow calming yet ominous. Do you think we can really get away from them? Carter's expression grew serious. We don't have a choice. Giving up isn't an option. As they drifted through the asteroid field, the proximity sensors beeped again. Carter cursed under his breath. The Syndicate ship was back, more determined than ever. This time, two smaller escort ships flanked it, weaving through the field with surprising agility. They brought backup, Carter muttered. Figures. What do we do now? Liara asked, gripping the edge of her seat. Carter's eyes narrowed as he studied the field around them. We fight smarter, not harder. He activated the ship's mining laser, a tool meant for cutting through asteroids, not combat. Aiming carefully, he fired at a large asteroid near the pursuing ships. The beam cut through the rock, causing it to break apart and scatter debris in all directions. One of the escort ships was caught in the explosion, spinning out of control before crashing into another asteroid. The other ship dodged the debris and continued its pursuit, but Carter was already moving on to his next tactic. Liara, he said, his tone urgent, I need you to reroute power to the aft shields. Can you do that? Liara's eyes widened. I don't know how. You'll learn, Carter interrupted, pointing to the console. Follow my instructions. Now. Liara hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Her hand shook as she accessed the ship's systems, following Carter's guidance. Despite her inexperience, she managed to divert power to the shields, reinforcing them just as the Syndicate ship opened fire again. You're a fast learner, Carter said, giving her a quick nod of approval. Now hang on. He angled the freighter toward a cluster of particularly dense asteroids, using their gravitational pull to slingshot the ship around them. The maneuver put them behind a remaining escort ship, giving Carter a clear shot with the mining laser. He fired, hitting the ship's engine and disabling it. The Syndicate's main ship, not alone, hesitated at the edge of the asteroid cluster. Carter smirked. Looks like they're reconsidering their life choices. Liara couldn't help but smile, her fear replaced by a glimmer of hope. We did it. For now, Carter said, his tone cautious. But this is just the beginning. They'll be back. As they cleared the asteroid field, Liara leaned back in her seat, exhausted but relieved. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. She wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to survive. Carter glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Not bad for your first chase, kid. Stick with me, and you might just make it out of this alive." Liara returned his smile, clutching the sphere tightly. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The bond deepens. The freighter glided through the quiet expanse of space, far from the chaos of the asteroid field and the relentless pursuit of the Syndicate. For the first time in hours, the cockpit was silent, save for the gentle hum of the ship's engines. Carter leaned back in his pilot's chair, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his mind still racing. Liara sat in the co-pilot's seat, the glowing sphere resting on her lap. She traced her fingers over its shifting patterns absent-mindedly, her thoughts far away. She was safe for now, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on her. Carter said, breaking the silence. "You okay?" She looked up at him, startled. "I think so," she replied, her voice soft. "It's just a lot." Carter nodded, understanding all too well. "It always is." Liara studied him for a moment, her glowing violet eyes searching his face. "Why did you help me?" she asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop herself. Carter didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the stars, his jaw tightening. "I've been where you are," he said finally, his voice low. "Alone. Scared. Running from something bigger than I could handle." Liara blinked, surprised. "You?" He nodded, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "Lost my crew a few years back. A job went sideways, and I was the only one who made it out. After that, I told myself I'd keep my head down, avoid trouble. But," he gestured vaguely toward her, "then I saw you. Couldn't just walk away." Liara's throat tightened. She hadn't expected such honesty from him, and it made her see him in a new light. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "about your crew." Carter shrugged, though his expression betrayed the pain he still carried. "It's the way of the galaxy. You lose people. You move on." She wanted to say more, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she shifted her focus to the sphere in her hands. Its glow seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, almost as if it were alive. "Do you think we can stop them?" she asked, her voice trembling. Carter glanced at the sphere, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we can't let them get their hands on that thing. Whatever it is, it's worth enough to risk everything for." Liara sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I don't even know why it chose me." Carter frowned. "Chose you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I've been thinking about it. The overseer and his guards. They were terrified of this thing. They wouldn't touch it. But when I picked it up, it didn't hurt me. It felt like it was waiting for me." Carter leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "If that's true, then maybe you're the reason they want it so badly. They think you're connected to it somehow." Liara shivered at the thought. "I don't want to be connected to it." "Too late for that," Carter said, though his tone wasn't unkind. "But look at it this way. If it chose you, maybe that means you're the only one who can stop them." Her eyes widened. "You think so?" Carter shrugged. "I don't know, but I've seen stranger things." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their situation settling over them. Then Liara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Carter raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For everything," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "For not giving up on me. For risking your life to save me." Carter waved a hand dismissively. "Don't get all sentimental on me, kid. I'm just doing what anyone would." Liara smiled faintly. Not everyone would. He didn't respond, but a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. The proximity alarm suddenly blared, shattering the quiet moment. Carter bolted upright, his eyes snapping to the console. "What now?" he muttered, flipping switches and scanning the readouts. "What is it?" Liara asked, her voice tinged with fear. Carter frowned. "Looks like a distress signal. Weak, but close by." "A trap?" she asked, clutching the sphere tightly. "Maybe," he admitted, "but we won't know unless we check it out." Liara hesitated, then nodded. "We should help, if it's real." Carter glanced at her, a mixture of admiration and exasperation in his eyes. "You've got a good heart, kid. Just hope it doesn't get us killed." He set a course for the signal, the freighter shifting direction smoothly. As they drew closer, a small battered ship came into view, its hull scorched and its engines flickering weakly. Carter activated the comms. "This is the freighter Arcadia. Do you copy?" he said. A crackling voice replied, weak and distorted. "Help. Under attack. Syndicate." Carter's heart sank. "Looks like we're not out of the woods yet." Liara swallowed hard, her fear returning. "What do we do?" Carter's eyes hardened. "We do what we can." As the freighter closed in on the distressed ship, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. But for the first time in years, he wasn't running away. He was running toward the danger. And he wasn't doing it alone. The final stand. The freighter hovered silently in the shadow of a massive derelict station floating in orbit around a dying planet. The station, a forgotten relic of some long-extinct species, was a maze of decaying metal and dim corridors. Carter had docked his ship at the edge of the structure, keeping it hidden from scanners. This was their last chance to get ahead of the syndicate. Liara stood at the cargo bay door, the glowing sphere cradled in her arms. Its light seemed stronger now, almost as if it could sense the growing tension in the air. She glanced at Carter, who was strapping on a tactical vest, loaded with tools and weapons. His expression was grim but focused. "Are you sure this is going to work?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Nope," Carter replied, tightening the strap on his shoulder holster. "But it's the best shot we've got." The plan was simple in theory: get to the station's core and use its ancient communication array to send the artifact signal across the galaxy. If the artifact truly held the power Lyra believed, the signal would alert anyone capable of stopping the Syndicate from exploiting it. Of course, the Syndicate wasn't going to make it easy. Their forces had tracked them to the station, and Carter knew it was only a matter of time before they breached the outer hull. "Stay close to me," he said, checking the charge on his blaster. "And if things go sideways, you run. Don't look back." Lyara's eyes narrowed. "I'm not leaving you." Carter glanced at her, surprised by the determination in her voice. "You're stubborn, you know that." She gave him a faint smile. "I learned from the best." He chuckled despite himself and motioned for her to follow. They stepped into the station, their boots echoing on the cold, metallic floor. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, and faint sparks flickered from damaged panels lining the walls. "Keep an eye out," Carter muttered. "This place is ancient, but that doesn't mean it's safe." Liara nodded, her senses on high alert. As they moved deeper into the station, the faint hum of the artifact grew louder, almost as if it were guiding them. Liara glanced down at the sphere, its patterns shifting rapidly. "It's pulling us towards something," she said softly. "Let's hope it's something good," Carter replied, his grip tightening on his blaster. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the corridors, followed by the sound of boots pounding against metal. Carter cursed under his breath. "They're here." He pulled Liara into a shadowed alcove, pressing a finger to his lips. They listened as Syndicate soldiers spread out, their voices barking orders in a guttural alien language. Carter peeked around the corner, counting at least 10 heavily armed soldiers moving toward their position. "Great," he muttered. "They brought the welcoming committee." "What do we do?" Liara whispered, her voice barely audible. Carter's mind raced. They couldn't take on that many soldiers head-on, but he had one advantage: the station itself. Its decaying systems were a hazard to anyone unfamiliar with its layout. "We use the station against them," he said. "Follow my lead." They crept through the corridors, Carter triggering traps and activating malfunctioning machinery as they went. Sparks flew, bulkheads slammed shut, and ancient defense turrets sputtered to life, forcing the Syndicate soldiers to scatter. Lara watched in awe as Carter expertly navigated the chaos. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "Let's just say I've had a lot of practice running from people who want me dead," he replied with a wry grin. Despite their efforts, the Syndicate soldiers regrouped quickly, their numbers and discipline proving difficult to counter. Carter and Lyra found themselves cornered in a large chamber filled with towering machines that hummed with dormant energy. "This is the core," Lyra said, recognizing the architecture from the artifact's glow. "We're here." "Good," Carter said, his voice strained. "Now figure out how to use that thing before they catch up." Lyra hesitated, staring at the artifact. "I don't know how." "You'll figure it out," Carter interrupted, moving to cover the entrance. "Just trust yourself." Lyra took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she placed the sphere on a pedestal at the center of the room. The patterns on its surface shifted rapidly, and a low hum filled the chamber, growing louder with each passing second. Meanwhile, Carter exchanged fire with the Syndicate soldiers, his blaster bolts lighting up the dim room. He was outnumbered, but his determination didn't waver. "Any time now, kid," he shouted. "I'm trying," Lyra yelled, her voice filled with frustration. Suddenly, the artifact flared to life, sending out a wave of energy that rippled through the station. The lights flickered, and the dormant machines around them roared back to life. Lyra gasped as the sphere's pattern stabilized, and a holographic interface appeared above it. "I think I did it," she exclaimed. "Great," Carter said, firing another shot. "Now make it count." Lyra's fingers flew across the interface, guided by instincts she didn't fully understand. The artifact's signal pulsed outward, resonating across the galaxy. She could feel its power, its purpose. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a beacon, a call for help. The Syndicate soldiers faltered as the energy wave disrupted their weapons and communications. Carter seized the opportunity, taking down the remaining soldiers with precision. As the last soldier fell, Lyra collapsed to her knees, the artifact dimming slightly as its task was completed. Carter rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. She looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "So did you." The station trembled, the energy from the artifact destabilizing its ancient systems. "Time to go," Carter said, pulling her toward the exit. As they boarded the freighter and launched away from the crumbling station, Lyra watched the artifact pulse faintly in her hands. For the first time, she felt a spark of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered under the Syndicate's tyranny. "We've started something big, haven't we?" she asked. Carter smirked. "Yeah, but I got a feeling we're just getting started." The freighter disappeared into the stars, leaving behind the ruins of the station and the beginnings of a new fight for freedom. A new beginning. The freighter soared through the endless black of space, its engines humming softly. The tension that had hung over the cabin for days had finally begun to lift, though traces of it lingered like shadows. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring out at the star-streaked void, her hands resting on the now dormant sphere in her lap. Its once brilliant glow had faded, leaving only faint, pulsing patterns that reminded her of a heartbeat. Carter leaned back in the pilot's chair, one hand lazily gripping the control stick. His rugged face was worn with exhaustion, but his sharp brown eyes flicked between the navigation console and the quiet girl beside him. "You okay, kid?" he asked, breaking the silence. Lyra hesitated before nodding. "I think so." "That doesn't sound very convincing," Carter replied, his tone light but probing. She glanced at him, her glowing violet eyes filled with uncertainty. "We sent the signal. We stopped the Syndicate, at least for now." But what happens next? Carter exhaled slowly, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. What happens next, he said, is up to you. Liara frowned, confused. What do you mean? You've got something most people in this galaxy don't, Carter said, gesturing to the sphere. You've got a choice. You can keep running, hiding, trying to survive, or you can fight for something bigger. Liara looked down at the sphere, its faint glow reflecting in her eyes. She thought of her people, still enslaved by the Syndicate, their lives overshadowed by fear and oppression. She thought of the station, its ancient machines roaring to life as the artifact's signal called out across the stars. I don't know how to fight, she admitted softly. Carter smirked. You've been fighting since the day I found you. You just didn't realize it. Her lips curved into a small smile, though doubt still lingered in her expression. Do you really think anyone will answer the signal? That will find help. Carter leaned back, crossing his arms. The galaxy's full of people who hate the Syndicate as much as we do. Resistance fighters, rogue colonies, outlaws with a conscience. If there's one thing I've learned out here, it's that when someone stands up, others follow. Liara nodded slowly, her resolve strengthening. Then I'll fight, she said firmly. For my people. For everyone the Syndicate has hurt. Carter's smirk widened into a rare, genuine smile. That's the spirit. The ship's comm system crackled to life, interrupting their conversation. Carter reached over and pressed a button. A rough, static-laden voice filled the cabin. This is Captain Jurek of the Free Systems Alliance. We received your signal. Who am I speaking to? Liara's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Carter, her eyes wide with disbelief. He gave her a reassuring nod and hit the reply button. This is the freighter Arcadia, he said. I'm Carter, and I've got someone here you'll want to meet. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. That signal, was it from the artifact? It was, Carter confirmed. And the girl who sent it has a story you're going to want to hear. Understood, Captain Jurek replied, his tone serious. We're sending coordinates for a rendezvous. But be warned, the Syndicate won't let this go unanswered. They never do, Carter said with a shrug. We'll see you soon. The comm line went silent, and Carter leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, there you go. Looks like we've got allies. Liara stared at him, a mix of excitement and fear swirling in her chest. Do you think they'll really help us? They wouldn't have answered if they didn't mean it, Carter said confidently. But don't get too comfortable. This is just the start. Things are going to get a lot harder before they get better. Liara nodded, gripping the sphere tightly. I'm ready. Carter chuckled, shaking his head. You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. The ship's navigation system beeped, signaling their approach to the rendezvous point. Carter set the freighter on autopilot and stood, stretching his arms. Get some rest while you can. Once we dock, it's going to be all politics, plans, and plenty of people telling us what to do. Liara smiled faintly, standing as well. Thanks, Carter, for everything. He waved a hand dismissively. Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this mess. As Liara headed toward her quarters, she glanced back at him. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she thought she'd lost. Hope. Carter watched her go, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He didn't know where this road would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something that mattered. The freighter continued its journey, its destination marked by the faint shimmer of a distant star. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, two unlikely allies brought together by fate, bound by a shared purpose, and ready to take on a galaxy that desperately needed change.